So what is a GIS? Why are we here? What possible use could this be? What do you guys know about GIS coming into this class? So it's an information system that codes whatever information it is that you're gathering to a geographic location. So GIS means that you input data in the background, there is a database system to manage that data. And you typically output it in some presentation, whether it be a map, whether it be statistical data, whether it be some sort of analysis of the data, and you output that information to your target audience. So what types of motivations do we have for using GIS? What does it help us with in our world? You guys think of some examples?
I have a family member that works for the City Works department, and he uses GIS to show where road right-of-ways are, so that when they go out and trim trees in the summer, there's no arguments of whether or not certain things are on certain people's properties, and that it's the right-of-way of the city, not the right-of-way of the property owner.
That's a great usage. I can't tell you how many times I've heard of right-of-way arguments for cutting people's trees down. So mistakes such as cutting down somebody's tree and getting sued for it, mistakes such as running your boat into the rock that everybody knew that was there, but nobody put on the maps. GIS can save some really costly land management issues. If engineers used GIS within their AutoCAD drawings, they would have that spatial data already in there. It's something that AutoCAD and GIS can do, so you don't build your building in the wrong place. You don't design your building on the edge of a cliff. Understanding how all of that information plays together actually comes out to matter in the real world when we go to do the types of things that we as human beings are trying to accomplish. So understanding location is critical to our management of infrastructure. It's critical for our development of resources. It's critical for our protection of resources. It's basically a constant problem-solving process and solution. So these are just some examples. It's possible that all of you have seen the COVID-19 dashboards all over the place now, but Alaska's been using it heavily. Most of those have come to be served through Esri's ArcGIS online systems. Our government management systems are using ArcGIS online to show land management information, to show resource management information. They've done a really good job of going out there and providing easy ways for people to provide this information to the public. So it's becoming more and more part of our resource management programs. So it's definitely something that resource management professionals are going to have to thoroughly understand in the future. And I will show you some examples of that in one of our earlier labs. It's not our first couple of labs, but we'll be looking at examples of where you find data in Alaska. And a lot of that is changing rapidly because the places that we used to serve GIS data from were kind of custom built websites. And it's all starting to be gathered together in resources that are meant to be public facing and are meant to be available to anybody that wants to use that information that we've been paying for with our tax dollars for years, and sending it to some GIS specialist at your municipal department. All that stuff's now reaching the public again, which I think is pretty cool. Right, so here's just an example of how GIS is used in management of a community. So you have your green boundary of the city. The red boundary shows anywhere that they're concerned about storm surge. So this is a real life application of understanding your complex physical environment in a software environment and how that can be used. And again, in land management, we have all these resource agencies that are out there trying to manage human impacts on our environment to whatever level is needed for that specific park or resource. They're heavily relying on GIS information to use that, to do that. That's actually a big part of the work that I'll be doing this year, is updating a roads GIS database for a national wildlife refuge. And that's critical information that they need for their refuge management. And this was just an example. Hopefully it still lives there. Yeah. So GIS Day is not just an Alaska thing, it's an around the world thing. And this is a really great example from 2019. This is also a really great example of a story map, which we'll be looking at some story maps, and we'll be doing our final project as a story map. Because I think it's a really effective tool, and it's being adopted for more than just GIS. So the story map is essentially a website that can be used to show spatial data. It can also be used to show a lot of information. So this is just a presentation from a seminar that was held for GIS projects. So this is a great way to showcase all of the GIS projects because it shows a lot of visual information layered with the details that they're trying to present. And then story maps make it fun by allowing you to input imagery or other information. This also had some maps that I thought were really neat that I wanted you guys to see if they're still here. This is an example of a GIS data portal. Like I mentioned, they're pulling together public facing GIS information and putting it out there where the public can access it. So the municipality of Anchorage has one. The state of Alaska has developed one over the last year and a half or 2 years. That's gotten to be a really powerful connection to all kinds of data all over the state. So we'll be playing with that a little bit. And going on in this story that someone so nicely put together, you can see that you can provide a lot of information to the public through this environment. And one of the ways that's done here is through mapping. And I think Marta's map had some other, yep. So this is a mapping project that the state did to show coastal mapping priorities. So this was a survey. They collected information from people, got everybody to talk about their priorities and where we need to collect data around the state, areas where there's data gaps. So you can see not only is this a great way of then communicating this information to the people responsible for collecting the data, but they could also use this to collect that information from the public. So these are all projects that were done with ArcGIS or other GIS software, but I think most of them probably ArcGIS. And just examples of how that gets used in our state to make a difference for people right here in Alaska. So GIS, the geography part is fairly obvious. I've talked a lot about the information part, which is the attributes. There can also be a time component. So when we're looking at temporal data, we can look at change over time, development of problems over time. We can look at how geographic inventories have evolved over time. So if you have any familiarity with database systems, a GIS is not really all that different than any other database, except that it's basically, or in some sense, it's a database taken to its extreme. So without getting too deeply into the details of how an Esri geodatabase works or other Esri data storage methods, you can store significantly more data in a GIS data structure. So you're bringing in information from aerial imagery or satellite data or large temporal data sets or extremely detailed elevation models, and you're pulling all of that together into one system. So you can imagine sometimes you're handling massive amounts of data. So GIS systems are designed to juggle that with giving you the tools that you need to analyze that data as well as present that data. So it's kind of a truly impressive evolution of data management in a computer system. And it's driven a lot of our development of computers as well. Sorry. So it's fairly easy to understand how you might connect this data in an environment such as this. So you have a state with information connected to it. So we have information that describes the state of New Jersey, but you would also have features within that area that you could attach your information to. Sorry, figuring out where my slides went here. So within the state of New Jersey, you'll have a road network that could also store database information. And you'll also have points of interest that can store information. So all of those layers get pulled together into the database and contribute to your output of information. So why did we develop GIS? We've been making maps for hundreds of years, I think at this point is safe to say. I don't know when the first map was drawn. I should get some historic information on that, but we've come a long way in our presentation of paper maps. So why do we go to a GIS environment? Well, it's for data retrieval. Number one, it's hard to put endless amounts of information on a paper map. You end up with lots of paper maps, cataloging systems, libraries full of books of maps containing data that can't be readily updated. So when you take that and you put that into a digital environment, not only do you suddenly have way more data storage capacity, you have the ability to update it far more easily and to customize how you're going to show that information to the public. So you have a lot more flexibility on how you can then understand your information, and you can begin to analyze it in new ways that people probably didn't think about in a paper environment. The downsides to a GIS are batteries, as always. Power is a requirement, and some sort of technology to interact with it. So it's not necessarily as publicly accessible as other types of data presentation. We don't hand out little tablets with GIS maps to anybody who wants to walk around your community and get to know it. We hand around flyers, but these days those flyers are probably made from a GIS system. So the downsides are technological, and they're also being reduced and maintained. You can do a lot more with a tablet GIS system than you could even 5 years ago. You can go out and you can collect the data. You can use it to manage your inventory in the field. You can use it to collect information from the public. So again, those are technological challenges that we're already beginning to overcome. So GIS was developed kind of in conjunction with cartography systems, but has also developed out of those, and then pulling into the more recent fields of computer science that have made this all possible. But it's also helped drive some of that development of computer science, because the need to capture this information and to analyze it has driven a lot of the back-end development of how we use databases. And again, today, how we use the ArcGIS online environment to present information to the public, whether it be COVID mapping information or flood information, all of that is becoming much more accessible. So briefly, history of GIS begins in about the 1950s. And in the 1960s, a number of groups began to work on how that information gets developed. And then they started to pull that together into planning environments. So in the modern era, from whether you want to call that 80s on, I began to develop standards for GIS that allowed people to develop cross-platform and in different computing environments with different needs. They started to pull that standard together so that there could be simultaneous development of GIS systems, which is part of how we end up today with open source GIS software, as well as things like Esri and AutoCAD and other expensive software. All of that backend was done by agencies and companies and individuals working together. So to do GIS, you need some sort of network to store your information. You need some sort of hardware to use your system on, and then you need your software. And that information generally gets stored in a database. I find that in implementation, that information generally gets stored anywhere from 15 to 50 databases, depending on the project that I'm working on. Because really the nature of GIS is taking a lot of information from around the world and pulling that in together to present whatever it is that you're trying to present to your audience. So I will be sharing you guys a resource that I use, which is a list of all the different GIS sources that I use. And it's pretty long because you don't necessarily need the same information for every project that you do. And there's a lot of different information sources out there.